Hi, my name is Regina. I am the Digital Security Coordinator at an NGO based in Berlin. That means that I do a certain amount of internal support. I provide workshops for some of our partner organizations, and I write and maintain external-facing security education resources. And I'm here to talk a little bit about social engineering, improving security behaviors of people around you, and how some of the skills that you can use from one are or aren't applicable to the other. So, social engineering, getting people to change what they do, it's kind of just manipulating folks to, like, do what you want them to do, sort of, or not. So there are a few major differences. So when we're talking about social engineering, you normally think of the person who is doing the social engineering being very much in control. Whereas when you're talking about teaching, we really want to have the learner sort of driving everything. So just backing up a moment, like, what do we mean by social engineering? Because there's this huge, broad category of stuff that falls into that bucket. And so that includes, like, phishing and vishing and smishing and all of that. But it also includes a lot of the stuff that generally gets talked about in terms of, like, physical penetration testing, when you're not talking about lock picking, but instead you're talking about how do you walk in places. But it can also just include this whole general category of things that I tend to think of as fun hijinks, where basically what you're doing is you're basically figuring out how to set someone up to have a specific emotional journey so that they more or less do what you're hoping that they'll do. And then when we're talking about education, in this context, we're really talking about education for behavior change. So this is not like memorize your times table or like learn what what any specific framework is about. Instead, we're talking about how do you get people to have better passwords? How do you get people to log out of accounts that they're not using? Things more along those lines. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about these two general topics. So aside from who's in control or who's empowered in the situation, there's also a pretty major difference between whether you're aiming for trust or whether you're just aiming for rapport. The time frame for doing some social engineering, very different than like trying to teach your colleagues how to keep themselves safe, how to protect your company, whatever your context is, even if it's like your parents or your housemates, or anyone that you are desperately trying to give security advice to. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. And then the other thing is the way that you use emotions in social engineering should be very different than the way that you're using emotions in any kind of educational process. So part of this is in terms of who's in control. We have this idea called self-efficacy. It comes from Alfred Bandura, who's a psychologist, and basically it's the idea that someone believes in their ability to do a specific thing. And this ends up being really important when you're teaching someone to do something, because basically if they believe that they can do it, you're going to have a much easier time supporting them in doing it. Because when you're talking about social engineering, you're generally talking about, like, how do I get someone to do a thing? But when you're talking about digital security education interventions, you're generally talking about how do I get someone to get themselves to do a thing? And part of that kind of relies, and part of why there's this difference is when you're talking about social engineering, you're generally talking about, like, just building rapport. Like, how do I just get someone to like me? So rapport is about just like having this connection that you can kind of joke with someone. You probably also have rapport with like your colleagues, which you should. And it's generally helpful. Like, having a nice rapport with someone is going to help you regardless of what your goal is. But when you're dealing with, like, trying to actually get someone to learn and change their behavior, what you probably need is actually trust. What you probably need is not just someone to be like, oh yeah, that person, they seem friendly, I'd like to have a beer with them. But probably what you need is for someone to believe the things that you're saying, and to believe that they're accurate, and to believe that you have their best interest in heart, or that it's, like, close enough that they're willing to roll with it. So the other thing in terms of, like, trust versus rapport is, like, you can find all sorts of excellent guides to how to quickly build rapport. Trust tends to take a lot more time. You can also break rapport and trust fairly quickly, but trust is what you really need to, like, build in your relationships. So just like trust and rapport take different amounts of time to establish, when you're dealing with social engineering, you're almost always only needing to, like, keep stuff together until you get out. Like, if you're doing some kind of, like, face-to-face thing, you just have to make sure that they believe you as long as they're looking at you, or as long as they're, like, likely to call someone who's going to get you in trouble. Like, that's all you need the glamour to last. But when you're dealing with any kind of behavior change education, what you really need is something that's going to stick with people and that's going to be long-lasting. So it's not just, like, can I, while I am standing there with my coworker, get them to do the one thing I'm asking them to do this one time while I'm looking over their shoulder, but can I set them up so that they're going to do this thing that I've asked them to do and shown them how to do repeatedly over time. And as long as we're talking about time frames, it's really good to remember that everything fades over time. So when you're thinking about education and when you're thinking about, like, teaching or training people around you, it's good to remember that they will probably need, like, little refreshers, and to just plan on that. And it doesn't mean that you've failed, and it definitely doesn't mean that they've failed if they need a little bit of a reminder from time to time. So another area where there's this huge gap, but a certain amount of shared skills, is when you talk about the role of fear, especially in social engineering and education. So, like, when you're doing social engineering, if you can get someone a little scared, it's generally good. Because people who are scared don't really respond the way they probably should. So if you're trying to, like, get someone to do something that they're not technically supposed to, getting them a little bit scared can mean that they don't have the presence of mind and they can't center themselves well enough to really, like, think through what they're supposed to be doing. However, when you're doing something that is about teaching, that's the opposite of what you want. And you generally have a situation where when you're teaching someone, if they get scared, they're going to zone out. They're going to tune out. They're just going to, like, shut down a little bit. And some of that is because just like you can get really successful, or some people can get really successful with, like, creating fear and then immediately offering a solution. Like, the classic is, you have a virus, install this software to remove it. All that's doing is creating fear and then offering a pathway to release or relief from it. And so when you're talking about education, the pathway for relief tends to be shutting down and ignoring you. So if you're hitting that fear button a whole bunch, it may be great when you're trying to manipulate people, but it's going to be very counterproductive when you're actually trying to get people to understand and internalize what you're talking about. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is, like, yes, you may talk about scary topics depending on what your work is and depending on what kinds of trainings you may need to talk to your colleagues about. Some of them are scary. But if you can figure out ways of reducing the height of the fear that they're experiencing, or the height of whatever emotions they're experiencing, you're much less likely to have that whole search for relief and avoidance of the topic. So basically, feelings matter. Feelings matter a whole lot. And they matter not just for the people you're training or teaching, but they also matter for yourself. So there are a few really counterproductive effects of using like standard social engineering where you're just like, I know how to manipulate some folks. I know how to get places I'm not supposed to go. I know how to get a free cup of coffee. Like all of that. If you're using that on your coworkers, there's a really good chance that you might be normalizing certain kinds of risky behaviors. So that can include like getting them to override security controls instead of really talking them through. It can be getting information from them because it's easier to just get it from them than to like go through the right pathways. Just all of that, you're training them into being vulnerable to the kinds of techniques that you or some actual bad guy might be using on them. So the other really major problem with a lot of social engineering techniques, especially in a workplace, is kind of inherently when you go in and you try to manipulate people, you are being a creepy creeper. Like, it's just not nice. And so sometimes you're totally successful and you get away with it and you have the problems I mentioned on the last slide. But sometimes you have a colleague who's a little bit more sensitive and who has maybe like gone through some of that training. And instead, what you're doing is you're pushing the bad guy buttons, and this can potentially set off their spidey sense and have them just immediately categorize you as sort of a bad actor. And that means that you end up alienating the people who are best positioned to help you. It means that you are alienating the people who have the sensitivity to this stuff and could be bringing it to your attention when it shows up. Instead, you're making yourself someone that those people specifically do not want to approach. And that just generally drives people away, and it can also really feed into shadow IT type problems. So, this is a pretty good example of things that go wrong when you think that social engineering is the appropriate way to approach everyone in your life. So I've talked a bunch about like the disconnects and what doesn't work, but there are a whole bunch of skills from social engineering that do work really well when you're doing educational interventions. With both of them, you need to handle someone else's emotions, and you should create this nice journey that takes them along the path that they need to go, either to give you something they shouldn't, or to like get to a point where they can get themselves to have better security behaviors. And it's really about like orienting towards someone else's needs. There's a huge benefit to being able to read and respond to emotional cues, and elicitation techniques are huge in both. Like, being able to ask good questions that either help you get good information or help steer other people to where they need to be is incredibly powerful. And with that, just like know your own strengths and weaknesses. Build on your strengths, figure out how to counteract your weaknesses, ideally not the other way around. So, when you're dealing with adults, one thing that can be really useful is this idea of adult learning theory. And so it's this like whole area. There are many, many books on it. You could read some or not, because it can basically be summarized as it's not just that the person is an adult, meaning it's not just that they're over 18. It has to do with being ready to learn and open to what you're saying. So this is not about awareness raising. This is not about getting someone to recognize that security is a problem. When you're talking about actual education and actual learning, that part has to already be addressed. That's actually somewhere where rapport can be really helpful. If you're having a little bit of a rough time with someone, having a rapport can help them open up a bit and be receptive to what you're trying to teach them. But the 4 principles are basically, you need to have the people you're trying to teach be involved. And this can be asking them about their concerns, or just like asking what things they want to learn. You should be drawing on their experiences. So like, talk to them and ask them what they have noticed that relates to this, or if they've ever gotten like a spammy email, or whatever it is, so that they're able to access and connect it to things they already know. Make it relevant. People are generally not willing to like spend lots of time learning stuff that they don't see the point of. And then try to be problem-centered instead of content-centered. So teach them how to address something. But, you know, also balance it out with like base knowledge that can be helpful for them more broadly. As you're learning how to get better at teaching other people, it's really good to learn from others as well. So when you go to talks, when you go to presentations, think about what people have done that have worked really well. But when you do that, just keep in mind that different kinds of situations have different goals in terms of what people are learning. Sometimes it's just about facts. Sometimes it's broad frameworks. Sometimes it's about behaviors and habits. And you also have different kinds of audiences. Some of them are more technical. Some of them are less technical. How familiar you are or how formal of a setting it is all make a difference. So just be mindful. If you see something that works really well, it may only work really well for that kind of learning or for that kind of audience. So hopefully, you're in a place, if you're doing this kind of like teaching to others, where you really want to support them in being successful. And some good ways of making sure that you're really supporting them and that they have a much greater likelihood of succeeding and you have a much greater likelihood of not getting called to solve the same problem that you've solved like 12 times previously that you may be a little sick of, is figure out how you're actively going to support self-efficacy. Like, be aware of, like, what people say when they're like, I don't feel like I can do this, and actually address it and help them figure out what is holding them back. When something is hard, like, sometimes learning is hard. Validate it. Don't say, well, I think it's easy. One trick that I use a lot is saying, yes, it is absolutely hard now, but once you've done it a couple of times, it's not going to feel hard. Like, it's hard now, but it's not going to be. And that also helps set expectations, because it may be a situation where if it continues to be hard for them, they're doing something wrong. And so this can also be a way of making sure that you're catching people who might fall through the cracks. And it's also just generally good to provide encouragement. Like, we could all use a little encouragement from time to time. So basically, social engineering and education, different goals. Don't normalize bad stuff. Don't be creepy. It really helps when you know what you're trying to do. So even if it's just like writing down point by point what your goals are, what kind of things you want to cover, what success looks like for you, what success might look like for them, all of that can help you put together something that's more likely to actually work. And then just, like, be decent to the people around you. It's not just about, like, being a nice person. It also really does help, and it really will make you more effective. But you should also just be decent to people. Like, it's not that big an ask. So, that's it. I am happy to take questions, but I think I have, like, a minute and a half before I'm done. But come find me afterwards. I will be around, and you should all stick around because the next talk looks really interesting, and it's about AI or machine learning? Machine learning. Machine learning. Very different. But clearly no one has taught me well enough for me to do this. Anyway, thank you.